Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. Now, in last week's program, we discussed how the Argentinian president, Milei, is due to declassify his nation's secret Nazi files. But further to this development, the CIA declassified some of their files, particularly on Adolf Hitler, that show they did not believe the official report that Hitler died in his Nazi bunker in April of 1945. Revealing the possibility that he instead eventually escaped to Argentina. Now, we're approaching VE Day next month, and that marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And the truth reveals that Hitler escaped. That's what we're going to be discussing in this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Regan King, joined as always by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett. Absolutely sensational, stunning, and bizarre in some ways declassification, these documents back in 2020. The submission, it's fascinating, Simon.
No, it is. I'm not one for conspiracy theories, but when you have the kind of declassification of CIA files that refer to Hitler, when we look at some of the evidence that has been given to the prospect that Hitler possibly could have escaped death and fled to South America, where he lived out the rest of his life, either in Argentina or Colombia, gives this whole topic of World War II a completely different meaning and a different conclusion. All of us believe the historical accounts, the official accounts that Hitler died after taking Sinai in April 1945 in his bunker. The Soviets had his body, and they believe his body was burnt up, but his body has never been given up to kind of detail. And it was 10 years later that the German government actually declared Hitler dead.
And I mean, this could have a massive impact on our understanding of history and what happened. Look, 10 years after the fact, we see Germany, you said they've declared that Hitler is dead, but it was in the 1960s that allegedly Russia then destroyed the bodies that were found. So we don't have any way of testing, there's no way of tracing, there's no way of looking at DNA. You know, now these days we have technology that could assess and analyze, but it's all impossible now. In similar fashion, there's a lot of interesting elements that we're going to be unpacking from these CIA documents, including some potential photographic evidence, photography. There's a lot of people, I've seen some people who bear a shocking resemblance to such characters as Hitler and other individuals like that. But you know, we have to, as people who love history and who desire truth, look at the scenario and also be open-minded, because the reality of it is, Simon, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, Ephesians 6 says, but against principalities, against flesh and blood. Not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. And when we look at the scenarios that play out, we have to understand that even if you consider, okay, who are we trusting in this report? We're trusting Red Russia, right? And you can look over the years and see an immense amount of corruption. These were allies in the loosest sense of the term in World War II. We were co-belligerents. There was no real sense of honesty, integrity, or trust, hence you have the division.
And of course, after the Second World War, they were the enemies.
Of course, immediately.
After 1945, we had the onset of the Cold War.
Immediately.
And those diplomatic and military relations between the US, Britain, and for example, Moscow, all broke down, particularly with Stalin, and we saw this Soviet empire emerged out of the ashes. But also the fact of huge amounts of money that these Nazis would have accumulated to actually then bribe probably Russian officials and others could be used to actually hide the truth. Now, so we discussed last week how President Milei of Argentina is looking into declassification of his nation's Nazi files. That should be interesting. Will they discuss Hitler's whereabouts or whether Hitler came to Argentina? We don't know, but all we're going to do is look through some of the evidence and allow you to make up your own mind on whether Hitler escaped after the Second World War. We'll also see, for example, this is going to be a very important discussion point as we reach V-Day next month, the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And if Hitler did survive, then it completely rewrites that narrative. And I suppose if you were the Americans or the Allies and you couldn't prove that Hitler actually died in his bunker in April 1945, then there would be a great desire amongst the Jewish populations that certainly in the United States would be demanding that the US government hunt down Hitler. And also by Hitler announcing his death, this brings closure to the end of the Second World War, and the nations that obviously fought ferociously over those 6 years, particularly Britain, could go back to normal and start to rebuild their nations after the ashes of the Second World War. But it does prove some really interesting points, because the Daily Mail ran an exclusive article on the declassification of CIA files on Hitler last week that could dramatically alter our understanding of history and provide new insights into what happened to Hitler and the top echelons of the Third Reich. There was also a photo in 1955 of an individual resembling Hitler in Colombia. And this raises the question, if Hitler did escape, who aided, who abetted him, who helped him escape? The big question is, for example, what would the Allies do with this information almost 80 years on?
No, in one way, I don't know that anything can be done as such, other than it does show that there would be a complete lack of justice, you could say, in the here and now. Temporal justice, of course, I don't believe that we can look at post-World War II, Simon, and say that there was a heavy amount of justice doled out, and on behalf particularly of the genocide against the Jewish people. There were far too few Nazis who faced justice.
Only 5%.
It's incredible.
So only 5% of Nazi officials and collaborators ever received justice.
And our hope has to then be in heavenly justice, right? So exactly. The justice of this earth always is unjust. It always fails in various ways. Even the most righteous just practices in this life fall short of perfect justice. So we have to look at it and recognize God is just. He is the one who judges and condemns, and definitely has done so. And yet at the same time, what are the ramifications for our understanding of World War II, our understanding of history? Who lied? Was there collusion, even on the Allies' part to some degree? Was there an understanding, even within Britain and the United States, that Hitler was very much active, and did they view it was in best interest to perpetuate or propagate a lie that he had died there in his bunker? Is there any degree in which we could look at this and say that there was some measure of complicity in allowing Hitler to continue in Argentina? Now, of course, the CIA was looking for him 10 years later. There was that sense of finding him, so one would think, and one would hope that there was that element of looking to hunt him down. I would be keen to hear as well if there were any discussions taking place not only between the CIA but eventually with Mossad and other agents. We were talking last week about Eichmann and the Eichmann trial and how he was apprehended from Argentina. Was there any sense of thought in the early days of the reformed Israeli state that this heinous individual, this worker of great evil and destruction against the Jewish people, could still be alive?
Well, we're never going to know, but maybe we will know if other more revealing documents come to light. So the Daily Mail, back on Friday the 4th of April, published this article under this headline: Declassified CIA docs reveal Hitler's secret escape after World War II as new Nazi report set for release. So they say that shocking documents declassified by the CIA have revealed a secret mission to find Nazi leader Adolf Hitler 10 years after he supposedly died. According to multiple reports from the CIA archives, agents in South America were convinced the dictator was still alive in the 1950s and changed his name to remain undercover. One operative even say they found a photo in Colombia showing a man who resembled the infamous Nazi. Despite the Allied forces finding a burnt body suggesting Hitler took his own life in a German bunker in April 1945, documents declassified in 2020 revealed the US intelligence officials were trying to locate his hideout in Argentina just months after World War II ended. Goes on to say, over the next decade, that search apparently never ended. The CIA was still talking with informants who allegedly knew about Hitler's secret escape route in 1955. Although the trail of documents appeared to end in November 1955, a shocking announcement out of Argentina is now reawakening the case.
It's interesting as we see that how in March, President Javier Milei of Argentina then ordered his government declassify all documents on Nazis who sought refuge and were protected by the country after World War II. Argentina was a notorious hideout for former members of the Nazi Party escaping punishment for war crimes 80 years ago, and now these documents could complete the puzzle, this infamous CIA cold case. The unearthed documents describe how the U.S. War Department sent information to the FBI that Hitler may have a secret hideout at a spa hotel in La Falda, Argentina. The October 1945 file, so this is fresh. This is right off the back of the end of the war here. October 1945 file revealed the owners of this hotel were major supporters of the Nazi Party, making financial contributions to the propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels, and became close friends of Hitler. According to U.S. intelligence, Hitler never forgot the family's allegiance to the Nazis and even lived with them in the same hotel on their vacations in Germany. The War Department told the FBI that they were convinced that Hitler would retreat to the hotel should Germany lose World War II or he was deposed as the Nazi leader.
So let's have a look at this very, very powerful trailer that was released last year from Netflix entitled Hitler and the Nazi Evil on Trial, just to give us an impact of the impact that the Nazi regime had on Germany and the rest of Europe.
Adolf Hitler and his henchmen plunged the world into one of the most destructive wars in history. Now, those Nazi leaders were waiting trial for crimes against humanity.
The wrongs which we seek to condemn have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated.
What happened in Nazi Germany, it doesn't happen suddenly.
Hitler was tapping into existing feelings in the German population.
Evil men can convince ordinary men to do evil things.
Hitler's whole motivation in life was to exterminate an entire race.
How could there be justice after that?
The world we live in now seems to have forgotten many of the lessons of what happened in Nazi Germany.
and how truly right and terrifying it is that wicked men can convince seemingly ordinary men to join them in their acts of extreme depravity, just as the trailer for that program indicated. I mean, we're students of history, Simon. We love history, and we desire to look at history through a lens of every angle, essentially, to get the big orbed picture of it. And when you have documents that are declassified, like the CIA documents, it does give rise to quite a few questions, does it not?
Absolutely.
We shouldn't, I don't believe in questioning everything, but I do believe in investigating everything.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think it's important to, and this is why we're doing the program on this one, it is the fact that we need to look at the evidence and examine the evidence for ourselves, and we can present the evidence. And it's important to know that if Hitler, for example, did escape and found safety in Argentina, then this changes the course of history.
Yeah.
This changes our whole perspective on what happened at the end of World War II, how the world's most vile, evil dictator potentially could have got away with mass murder. We're talking about the murder of over 6 million precious Jewish lives in the Holocaust. Yep. And he was directly responsible for the deaths of over 80 million people worldwide, including most of those civilians and a number of military personnel, 21 or 22 million. So we're talking about huge carnage, we're talking about huge destruction, huge death, and that he never faced justice. And that's why, if you want to read out this CIA document that was actually released on the 14th of July, 2020.
Here's that document. The following information, which concerns a possible hiding place for Hitler in Argentina, has been passed on to us by a source, the reliability of which is unknown to us at this time. One, and the name is redacted somewhat, reported to be a reputable member of Argentine society and the proprietor of the largest spa hotel in La Falda, Argentina, recently made the following observations. A, that even before the Nazi Party was founded, she made available to Goebbels her entire bank account, which at the time amounted approximately to 30,000 marks, which money was to be used for propaganda purposes. That she and her family have been enthusiastic supporters of Adolf Hitler since the Nazi Party was founded. C, that this voluntary support of the Nazi Party was never forgotten by Hitler, and that during the years after he came into power, her friendship with Hitler became so close that she and members of her family lived with Hitler in the same hotel on the occasion of their annual visit to Germany. And D, that if Hitler should at any time get into difficulty wherein it was necessary for him to find a safe retreat, he would find such safe retreat at her hotel in La Falda, where they had already made the necessary preparations.
And the Daily Mail article goes on to say the following. The Daily Mail go on to report from the declassified CIA files that while while Allied forces said that they found Hitler's charred remains, another CIA document released in 2020 included a photo of a man believed to be the Nazi leader sitting with a friend in Colombia in 1954. The report from the 3rd of October 1955 clearly stated that a US intelligence operation was taking place in order to confirm whether or not Hitler, also referred to Adolf Hitler in the files, had survived and secretly relocated to South America. So the file revealed that an informant known as Colombia 3 spoke to a trusted friend who served under Hitler's command in Europe and had escaped to Maracaibo in Venezuela. The friend said that a man by the name of Philip Citron, a former SS trooper, claimed that Hitler was still alive in Colombia and that he spoke with the former Nazi leader monthly, and he took a recent picture with him. It goes on to say that Colombia 3's friend, whose name was not given, was able to unknowingly steal the picture on September the 28th, 1955.
In it, the man alleged to be Hitler was referred to as Adolf Hitler. He was photographed sitting on a bench next to Citroën in Tunia, Colombia. And the report added that the former Nazi soldiers claimed Hitler eventually moved to Argentina in January of 1955, so 10 years after he was allegedly found dead. By the time U.S. intelligence agents acquired the photo and made copies, World War II had been over for a decade, and the Nazis believed him to be immune to prosecution. Philip Citroën commented that inasmuch as 10 years had passed since the end of World War II, the Allies could no longer prosecute Hitler as a criminal of war, the document stated. And despite the alleged SS troopers' claims, U.S. agents continued to hunt for Hitler, even though skeptics in the intelligence community called the photograph a fantasy. On November 4th of 1955, intelligence headquarters in Washington approved of agents making contact with a person known in the files as Guerrilla in order to further investigate the history of Adolf Hitler in Colombia prior to 1955. However, the same classified document distributed to agents in South America also suggested that the case be dropped. It is felt that enormous efforts could be expended on this matter with remote possibilities of establishing anything concrete, intelligence officials admitted.
It goes on to say that no other documents in this string of reports appear to publicly be available in the CIA's declassified files, suggesting that the matter was dropped or anything else that was discovered may still be declassified by the US government. And then we see also that Argentina's decision to follow up America's lead in declassifying troves of old cases could soon open up even more information about the Pentagon's dealing with the Nazis in South America. It is also a matter of fact that public record that the US government recruited former German scientists after the Second World War to work for America. Goes on to say this program was known as Operation Paperclip, ended up bringing roughly 1,600 German scientists to the US, including Werner von Braun, who famously paved the way for NASA and America's early space missions. The new Argentinian documents are expected to detail the country's involvement with the rat lines, the secret international escape routes the Nazis used to flee Germany before the end of the Second World War. It's currently unknown if any of the soon-be classified reports will add any more evidence to the CIA's files on Hitler's alleged escape from death. And there we go. I mean, that's the article that the Daily Mail have actually produced, which really does show and open up questions as why would the CIA invest so much time, resources and efforts to hunt down Hitler if they genuinely believed that he died in a bunker in May 1945? You wouldn't do it.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they definitely believed this was credible enough to look into. Then, of course, though, they suspended it because they felt that there was nothing concrete that they would find. So who is this Adolf character that they were looking into? Was any further insight found concerning him in either Colombia or Argentina? Is that possible to even look into once more? But the official account of Hitler's death remains, according to the US-based Fox News reported on 27th of March of 2025 that secret documents on Nazis who fled to Argentina after World War II are being declassified. They unpack some of the background again concerning the official story regarding Hitler, and they say that Hitler committed suicide by taking a cyanide capsule and shooting himself in Berlin in 1945. His body was later discovered by Soviet soldiers and buried in an unmarked spot. A German court declared Hitler dead, but not until 1956, more than a decade after the war ended. His wife Eva Braun also killed herself by swallowing a cyanide pill. Eichmann, one of the main architects of the final solution, escaped Europe after World War II and was living in Argentina under an assumed name when Israeli agents snatched him off of a street in 1960. He was later tried and hung in Israel. Mengele, meanwhile, was arrested by U.S. forces in 1945, but released shortly after, spending years on the run, and was infamous for carrying out brutal medical experiments, arriving in Argentina in 1949, living there for a decade before fleeing to Paraguay and later to Brazil, where he lived and died only in 1979.
The Fox News report goes on to say that in 2017, the CIA declassified a document revealing that the intelligence agency investigated the possibility that Adolf Hitler was alive in South America as late as 1955, nearly a decade after the Second World War ended. They said the three-page document, which appears on the CIA's website, highlights a former SS soldier who told spies that he had regularly met with Hitler in Colombia. The document suggests that Hitler may have worked as a shipping company employee prior to potential fleeing to Argentina. On the second stage is a picture of the informant, Philip Citron, with a person he claims is Hitler in the mid-1950s. The Nazis fled to several countries in the Americas following the war, including the US, Canada, and Mexico. In 2020, a cache of documents appeared to identify more than 12,000 Nazis who lived in Argentina in the 1930s and who had one or more bank accounts to what is now called Credit Suisse Bank. The Simon Wiesenthal said that the files were found in a storeroom at a former Nazi headquarters in Buenos Aires. So let's have a look at this new film coming out that looks at the Nazi propaganda machine that was run by Joseph Goebbels, and the title of this is called Goebbels and the Führer. This is the official trailer.
Seid ihr entschlossen?
Ich werde das Publikum in den Wahnsinn treiben.
Wir stimmen ein Höllenkonzert an. Immer weiter hetzen und putschen.
Auf den Führer! Wir sind so wahrheitsgetreu, wie es uns nützlich ist. Propaganda, das ist eine Kunst wie die Malerei.
Wir schaffen die Bilder, die bleiben werden. Bravo.
Es ist uns eine Ehre, dass Sie uns besuchen kommen, mein Führer.
Die Goebbels sind die Vorzeigefamilie des Reichs.
Wir müssen unsere Probleme mit Gewalt lösen. Jede Generation muss einmal einen Krieg mitgemacht haben.
Stopp! Der Führer zittert nicht. Diese Aufnahmen wird das Volk niemals zu sehen bekommen. Ich habe den Führermythos geschaffen. Wissen Sie, wie der Propagandaminister oder Engländer oder Stalins heißt?
Aber Joseph Goebbels, den kennt jeder.
Euer Vater wird mit seiner Rede in die Geschichte eingehen.
Das Radikalste ist gerade radikal und das Totalste gerade total genug.
Wir werden mit ihm in die Geschichte eingehen.
Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?
And in this week's Behind Headlines, we are joined by Elliot Chertoff, joining us from northern Israel, and he's a major in the IDF reservists. Elliot, thank you so much for being able to join us from northern Israel today. And can you just share a little bit about your background, particularly your military credentials, the fact that you are a major and a reservist in the Israeli army, but you're also an historian, and you've certainly in recent years reached out to Christian organizations, particularly the likes of the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem.
Well, first, I'm not an historian. I'm a strategist, an expert in international relations, political and military analysis. I'm a consumer of history, not a producer. So not so much a historian as a reader of history. And I've been an officer in the IDF since 1985, doing various things over the years, more and more desk-oriented as I've gotten older, and have been working with contact interaction with the Christian community now for about 15 years in the United States and in Israel with Christian communities from around the world.
That's fantastic. Now, there's been some recently unpacked, declassified CIA documents, which shed a little bit of doubt on the normal historical relay of what actually happened to Hitler. Despite Allied forces finding a burnt body in Hitler's hideout, suggesting that he took his life in this German bunker in April of 1945, some declassified documents from 2020 show that U.S. intelligence officials were trying to locate his hideout in Argentina just months after World War II ended. Do you think that there's any reason to consider whether or not Hitler actually survived World War II?
I think it's worth considering, but I wouldn't put a lot of weight into it. First of all, the evidence in the bunker, what the Russians found, not only with the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun, who by the time she committed suicide was Eva Hitler, but also the bodies of the Goebbels who killed themselves, and their bodies were burned not far from the Hitler's bodies, matched very closely the testimony of the survivors of the bunker, and it was pretty much assumed by the Russians who did tests on it, and that's what they publicized ultimately and much later, was that they actually found Hitler's body. Now, there's no guarantee. The Russians claim to have destroyed the remains sometime in the 1960s, so there's no way of going back on that. I would say that leaves obviously a window, an opening. There's no, in the absence of proof, you have to leave, some percentage opening. We know that many Nazis escaped from reasonably high-ranking and not very well known people like Müller, who was the head of the Gestapo, got to South America. Eichmann, of course, was captured by the Israelis. Mengele and a whole bunch of people of that rank and up and down. But let's also keep in mind that the top Nazis, for all of their attempts, and some attempted and some didn't to escape, were caught. Goering was caught without an attempt to escape. Himmler was caught and committed suicide shortly after his capture. He had shaved off his mustache and tried to hide out as a British soldier and was captured. So is it possible that Hitler slipped through? Of course it's possible. I would say that having read the reports, the CIA reports, what we read are reported sightings and not much more than that. In other words, there's not much of a thread beyond that, and that makes me skeptical.
Elliot, why would the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, spend 10 years hunting for someone they thought might actually be Hitler, if they felt that Hitler had actually died in the bunker in Berlin back in May of 1945? Why would they invest so much time, effort, money and energy to see if Hitler was alive? Because clearly we know that the Argentinian government at the time smuggled 5,000 former Nazis into Argentina. So is there a chance that he could have been smuggled in to Argentina? And of course, this would have been on the radar, possibly of the CIA for 10 years, as these declassified files reveal.
As I said, first of all, certainly possible. And if we were having this talk in 1950 or 1952, I might be saying something very different from what I'm saying now. We're talking about the period in the few years after World War II, many active Nazis. There are a lot of unknowns in that period. And I think that if for no other reason, the organizational coup of finding Hitler and capturing him would have justified the investment of assets and resources for the CIA. Let's keep in mind that sometimes you invest a lot in an investigation and come up with nothing. In this case, as I said, I think the potential reward for scoring was worth it to them, and I'm not critical of that. I think it was the right decision to invest for that investigation. But now we're decades later, and many Nazis were caught up with, including, as I said, Eichmann, who was brought to Israel and interrogated before his trial and execution, and many others who were interrogated in the field and never brought to trial. They were brought to justice, let's say, the hard way in the field, and no real thread that leads to Hitler. Now, could Hitler have possibly gone to ground somewhere in South America and become a nobody, and nobody knew about it? Certainly possible. That wasn't Hitler's personality, though. So nobody knows. As I said, a couple of sightings that could have been legit in the sense of the people really thought they saw what they thought they saw. And it could also be, and this is very common in the business, people who give false information for a whole bunch of reasons, including personal aggrandizement, so that they can pick up a fee or a reward or whatever. The bottom line is that he simply disappeared, and the CIA, with all of its work, didn't find him either. So, the reports, the sightings, the hearings didn't lead anywhere, and that leads me to believe that the original story is correct.
Thank you for your insights on that. If Hitler had survived, what would the impact be on the common narrative concerning post-World War II?
So once again, if we were having this discussion in 1950, a live Hitler with what we know were post-war Nazi organizations, SS organizations that operated not only in South America but also in the Arab world, could have been a potential danger to the free world. How much of one is hard to say, but Hitler is Hitler, and if he were really out there, then it could have made a huge difference. If, as I said before, he simply went to ground, changed his name, became some as if Argentinian peasant, then basically he escaped justice, and there isn't much more to it beyond that.
And Elliot, there was a recent news report that was released last month that the Argentinian president, President Milei, who's a great friend of Israel, he had 2 days of national mourning for the Bibas family, has said that he's going to declassify his own nation's Nazi files. Could this be revealing and bring a real spotlight into those routes that the Nazis took, from fleeing possible prosecution in Europe to finding safe haven in Argentina, to the extent that Argentina hosted 5,000 former Nazi criminals responsible for mass genocide?
Of course, it's important. Here again, those of us who are familiar with it, I think, and I include myself among them, won't be terribly shocked by anything we read. It'll add additional information. It'll add volume. There might be names that we weren't aware of, and who knows? Maybe Hitler is one of them. As I said, I don't negate it as an absolute impossibility, but we will likely get the answer to questions of others who disappeared, and we'll find out that they ended up in Argentina. And let's keep in mind that one of the routes to Argentina led through the Vatican, and that's going to be a story in and of itself if that's connected to what he releases. It'll be a boon to historians, and I think it'll have value because it will bring the topic back to the surface. And I think that keeping in mind what happened in World War II and its aftermath it's an important memory that, as we can see by what's going on in many countries in the West today, including Great Britain, the United States, and others, the world has forgotten what the Nazis did to the Jews.
Absolutely. And finally, Elliot, how important is it that the survivors, the last remaining Holocaust survivors, as well as their families that have been affected by the Holocaust, the a murder of over 6 million precious Jewish lives on an industrial scale at the hands of the Nazis, that there is some sort of justice and understanding of the role that Argentina played in helping these Nazi war criminals escape and live in peace for the rest of their lives, and how justice needs to be served regarding this?
Well, at this point, I don't see justice per se, but I do see closure. I do see the importance of a country like Argentina stepping up and saying, we were guilty of this, albeit decades ago. I don't think that you can accuse this generation or hold them accountable for what was done a generation or two ago, but they're coming forward and admitting it and saying this happened, and it happened on our territory, in our government, and by making it public, in some way trying to atone for it, is very important. And for survivors in particular, as I said, first of all, possibly learning about individuals who had particular impact on them and on an individual level is a sense of closure. And once again, fighting that insidious attempt that's been going on also for decades to either deny or forget the Holocaust.
Elliot, thank you so much for joining us from Northern Israel today on Behind Headlines. You've done a great job. Thank you so much for informing us and giving us great insight into this story. So shalom and God bless from us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, very thankful to Elliot Cutoff there for his interaction and for his input on this very fascinating subject, Simon. And, you know, it's one of those things that will we ever fully know? Will we ever fully understand what exactly happened definitively? I don't think that's possible. We have exactly as we were talking about, just the reality of the initial idea that was put forward that his body and Eva's body and the Goebbels, that, you know, this was the official narrative. But then why do we have 10 years later the CIA?
Well, they followed up straight away, months. Yeah. Literally months after the end of the Second World War in Europe. Of course, we're still, the Second World War officially didn't come to an end until August of 1945. But literally straight after, with the formation of the CIA, went straight off to South America to try and see if reports that Hitler had escaped. So we know also that high-ranking Nazi officials also escaped. 5,000 Nazi officials escaped to South America. So it does conclude with the possibility that Hitler could escape. Now, you would also need the infrastructure. And the fact is that the Nazis would have had huge amounts of money that they would have stolen off their Jewish victims, amassed themselves incredible wealth, incredible money that was then, put into Swiss bank accounts, because we know that Switzerland funded the Nazi Third Reich, so that money was safe. So all it needed was that money then to be given to the likes of the Vatican to actually then help these Nazis escape on the rat routes, find safe haven in Argentina. And whilst in Argentina, the Nazis could then pay off the Argentinian government huge amounts of money for their protection. But obviously, clearly, there was also an ideological link to the Nazis that the Argentinians had there in the 1950s as well, because this interesting report from Fox News that dates back to the 5th of March 2020, under the headline, 12,000 Nazis lived in Argentina in the 1930s with Swiss bank accounts, newly discovered documents show. The Fox News report says that according to the centre, much of the monies were transferred to secret Swiss bank accounts, including the former bank, which became the Credit Suisse Bank based in Zurich. They believe that some of these bank accounts may be among those listed in the newly discovered files in Argentina.
We believe that these long dormant accounts hold monies looted from Jewish victims, the center said in a statement that was released. During the 1930s, Argentina's former leaders, President Jose Felix Uribiru, who was nicknamed Von Pepe, and his successor, Agustin Pedro Justo, welcomed Nazis and other individuals, their ideals, their their ideology as well, incorporated that in. Now, there was anti-Nazi President Robert Ortiz, who attempted to weed out Nazis from the country after rising to power in 1938, but there were already thousands of Nazis living in Argentina. And of course, their ideology, Simon, would have been impacting and affecting those who were there, Argentinians as well. And so you have that history, you have that influence of Nazism deeply embedded in Argentina.
Absolutely, but we also have to look at the 1930s. And during the 1930s, with the rise of Mussolini, the rise of fascism in Europe, then followed by Hitler and the rise of Nazism, this was the ideology that no one spoke up against. You know, if we remember as well that Winston Churchill warned about the great danger posed to Britain and the British Empire from Germany and kept pleading with Parliament to rearm. Chamberlain, who was our Prime Minister at the time, didn't actually believe it until it was too late. We also saw, for example, that Hollywood decided to keep this quiet in the 1930s. America was very much influenced by isolationism, didn't want to get involved in European affairs, turned a blind eye to this. And also the fact that this new emerging fascist and Nazi ideology was a very popular ideology around the world until we saw its absolute true devastating impact. So you can see with the influence of Germans, expats living in Argentina, why they would have then supported the Nazi cause. But there's a very interesting declassification again, revealing information about other high-ranking Nazis who escaped to South America. So we see here that historical analysis of 20 name files from the CIA records by Dr. Richard Bretman, Professor of History at the American University, IWG, Director of Historical Research, the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998, and the initial search for information in classified American government records about the Holocaust and other crimes committed by the Nazis, Germany and its allies. Goes on to say that a second target of this law was the information about any individuals with Nazi pasts who have been used as an intelligence source and protected against prosecution after the Second World War. The Central Intelligence Agency has now located and declassified files on a substantial number of individuals suspected of involvement in criminal activity for the Nazi regime, its allies and satellites, and that would include Argentina.
I mean, it's fascinating, Simon. What do you think concerning this release? Why did we not see these files released until 2020?
Too much vested interests. I mean, for example, so many of these former Nazis could have still been alive. So that means that there would have been a huge demand for justice to bring these Nazi war criminals to trial. Of course, that's huge expense, huge effort involved in this one. And governments like Argentina wanted to keep this a secret. And other nations, also the Americans, didn't really want to reveal so much of this because it implicates them for bringing over 1,600 Nazi scientists to help develop America's NASA space program and ballistic missile program, and even America's nuclear program as well. So therefore, there wouldn't have been a vested interest to uncover that then, but of course, growing pressures from Jewish families and others wanting to get to the truth meant that this put pressure on politicians. So of course then we saw this act signed. But it does go on to say, for example, do you want to read out what it says about Adolf Hitler, which is according to the declassified?
Yeah, according to the 19 CIA name files that were opened, this represented the first significant product of the search within CIA records. This was opened in December of 2000. Adolf Hitler, the CIA's file on Hitler contains only one significant new document, an assessment of Hitler's personality by Dr. Ferdinand Sauerbruch, a famous German surgeon who spoke candidly with a man named Hans Bay about Hitler's growing megalomania during 1937. According to Bay, who gave this information to the OSS in 1944, Sauerbruch predicted some of what would continue to transpire in relation to Hitler, in that he would end up as the craziest criminal the world had ever seen.
And that's in 1937.
Yeah.
And in 1939, he invaded Poland and instigated the Second World War. Also, another famous Nazi known as Klaus Barbie. The CIA name a file on Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo official, widely known as the Butcher of Leon, includes copies of already known wartime German documents, substantial numbers of US Army and State Department documents, copies of press stories, congressional inquiries, materials about the Justice Department's study of Barbie, and the internal investigations by the Army and the CIA itself over alleged ties to Barbie. The basic picture emerging from those documents is widely known. The Counterintelligence Corps of the US Army predicted that Barbie and the war against the French prosecution and helped him reach South America.
As Barbie's escape gained notoriety in the 1980s, the CIA undertook a detailed examination of whether it might somehow be indirectly linked to Barbie. There were some concerns with Bolivian intelligence having used Barbie as a source, and some Bolivian officials may have passed on some of his information to local CIA officials. Also, a CIC unit was connected with or served as a front for the Office of Policy Coordination, which became part of the CIA in 1950. Someone looking back at events before 1950 might mistakenly think that Barbie had a connection with a CIA unit.
And the same document goes on to detail about Adolf Eichmann, which says Adolf Eichmann file divulges a little about the man and his career during the Third Reich. Documents in the file illustrate how the CIA and its predecessor agencies, known as the Strategic Services Unit and the Central Intelligence Group, as well as the Army's CIC, went about investigating rumors about Eichmann's whereabouts, mainly from hearsay and unsubstantiated assertions. The CIA did not seriously enter the chase for Eichmann until late 1959. But the Israeli agents located him in Argentina first and sprinted him out to trial. The file contains a number of different reports about unnamed CIA agents, for example, who source against a former Nuremberg prosecutor, Telford Taylor, termed cozying up or a dupe because he publicly advocated that Eichmann be tried by an international tribunal rather than the international court. It goes on to talk about Joseph Mengele, then it talks about Heinrich. But what also I think was really interesting is that we didn't cover in last week's Behind the Headlines was the Daily Telegraph reported on the 20th June 2017 artifacts that were found in Buenos Aires that belonged to Hitler himself.
Yeah, the Argentinian police were investigating whether an unprecedented find of Nazi artifacts, including personal effects used by Adolf Hitler, were brought into the country by infamous Holocaust physician Joseph Mengele in a room at the end of a secret passage concealed behind a false bookcase. Police in Buenos Aires stumbled upon the secret collection of 75 original Nazi objects. The main hypothesis among investigators is that the objects were taken to Argentina by a high-ranking Nazi after World War II, when the South American country became a key refuge for fleeing war criminals. Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death for his role in selecting victims at Auschwitz and performing horrific experiments on Jews and other prisoners, arrived in Argentina in 1949. And so the speculation is potentially that these objects were actually in Hitler's ownership and that Mengele brought them. But perhaps our discussion today is opening up another avenue of possibility.
Yeah, did they belong to Hitler, for example, and was this Hitler's secret hideout? I mean, we're coming to the end of the program, but serious questions need to be raised. If Hitler did escape Germany after the end of World War II and made his way to Argentina, firstly, who helped him escape? Who aided and abetted him? And, for example, what power have the Nazis then exerted in Argentina, with 5,000 Nazis finding safe haven in the South American country? What impact did the Nazis in Argentina have on West Germany in the post-war years, particularly in the 1960s, when we saw the denazification process end and the government of West Germany actively promoted former Nazi members to the judiciary and positions of ministerial influence within the German government of West Germany then.
If Hitler escaped to South America, the question needs to be asked, who aided and abetted him? Was there any collusion on behalf of the Allied parties as well? What power did the Nazis have in Argentina? What was their influence in West Germany? Like how these are questions that we'll continue to ask, questions that I'm not certain that they will be answered, but it's important when we study history to be open to the various scenarios and to recognize, particularly when there's not irrefutable evidence of one solution or another, that we maintain an open mind.
Absolutely, but I think we have to conclude that Nazism did not die in May of 1945 when the Soviet Red Army, together with the Allied forces, actually defeated the Nazi forces in Germany that brought an end to the war in Europe known as VE Day. We know that Nazism lived on in South America, that's for sure. Who aided, who abetted them? These are important questions that we need to ask, and we need the evidence to provide what happened, particularly the role of the Vatican Church, and how much money did the Nazis have to exert control and influence over Germany in the post-war years, but also what impact did they have on South American countries as well, keeping their demonic evil ideology alive. I think we have to keep an open mind whether Hitler died in a bunker in 1945 or whether he escaped to South America. These are questions that we don't know, but we need to find out. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.